watching BloombergQuint. We're here in Davos, right outside the Congress Center, at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, the 50th one, that is. I have with me Ian Bremmer. He's founder of the Eurasia Group and a renowned political scientist. Ian, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Oh, we see you guys, sure.
Let's start off with the news that broke the early part of this year, and that is the tensions between U.S. and Iran.
Yes.
But then things don't seem to have escalated to as badly as they could have gone, as most people estimated.
Not even close. They de-escalated. I mean, you know, the fact was that when the United States decided to respond, and they hadn't responded for 6 months. The tankers were getting hit in the Straits of Hormuz. You had the drone being knocked down. You had the Saudi oil processing facility getting hit by Iranian missiles. Trump did nothing. But when Trump did respond to Kirkuk, the base getting hit, and the Baghdad embassy being attacked, he responded quite strongly. And at that point, the Iranians understood what the red lines were. Iran may be an opponent of the U.S., but they're not suicidal, and they de-escalated dramatically. So clearly that was going to happen. The fact that the Iranians knocked down this civilian plane, an incredible tragedy, a huge mistake, and lied about it, has now put them under even more pressure, including from American allies in Europe, the Canadians, who had been a little more sympathetic to the Iranian position on the nuclear deal. They're under a lot of pressure right now, but they're not going to come and attack the U.S. anytime soon.
So where does this go from here?
Well, the Iranians try to wait out the U.S. elections in November, maintain social stability, and hope that Trump doesn't win. Because if you get a Democrat president, they'd be willing to go back to the terms of the old deal, which, of course, the Iranians were actually living up to the terms of. But if that's not the case, you know, demonstrations inside Iran will grow. So there's the potential that you actually have a real crackdown and the reformists are forced out. Or the Iranians come to the table. Trump gets a big win, and he actually gets a better deal than what Obama had actually done. That is possible here.
And that's wonderful for him in an election year.
Well, the deal's not going to come before the election, so from that perspective, It doesn't matter. But let's be clear, he just gave a speech that was kind of a victory lap, and he was mostly talking about the economy and the China deal and the USMCA deal. But he was also talking about Iran. He was also talking about killing ISIS terrorist heads. And, you know, there are some foreign policy issues that he can say legitimately that he's actually had some successes on. There are others where he's had failures. He's not paying attention to those. But generally speaking, you know, he has a list. He's now in re-election mode. That's clearly true.
This outing of his in Davos has been much better received than the first one 2 years ago.
Oh, much better received, and you feel it, right? I mean, look, there's no question. He only got one applause line. That was when he talked about planting a lot of trees, which is not something that's a priority of his. But when you talk to the delegates, and particularly the corporates, particularly the investors, the people watching your show, these are people who feel more comfortable with Trump now than they did 3 years ago. They're people that feel more comfortable with Trump than they do Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. And I think, you know, we have to understand that this is not a reflection of American society.
Of course not.
But it is a reflection of a group that is much closer to Donald Trump's agenda than, say, Greta Thunberg's. It's much closer to Donald Trump's agenda than it is those who oppose the globalism that Davos actually stands for. And that's an interesting point. Politics is making very strange bedfellows here.
Yeah, well, you've listed the U.S. election as the top risk.
I did.
In your global risk report that you released just a few days ago.
Yes.
And you said that you're not sure that either side will accept defeat, whichever side loses.
Correct.
And that is going to be a stalemate. What do we make of what that will mean for American democracy, American institutions, or even America's leadership of the world?
Well, you didn't ask me the impeachment question. I mean, Trump was giving his speech. He was giving his speech yesterday, and while he was, the Senate was advancing impeachment, and all of the votes went down 53-47. Why? Because the Republicans are all voting together. So impeachment is going to fail, and it's going to fail despite the fact that Trump has clearly committed abuses of power to try to help ensure that he wins the election. Now, once impeachment is broken as a political constraint on the American president, what's going to stop him from continuing to abuse that power in the run-up to November 2020? If he wins and it's close, the Democrats will say it's delegitimized. If he loses and it's close, Trump will say it's delegitimized. So we're entering into unprecedented territory with the U.S. election. Why is it risk number one? Because the U.S. is the world's largest economy.
I know, but what happens then? If he wins and the Democrats say this is illegitimate, what will that mean?
What it means is that for a period of weeks or months, we're not going to be quite sure who the president is. We're not going to be quite sure how America governs. It's going to become a legal battle. It'll go to the Supreme Court. There might be social instability. I mean, this is not something you see in the United States. Even with Gore Bush in 2000, it went to the courts, but both sides were prepared to accept the outcome of the courts. And of course, Gore and Bush were both prepared to do that. This is going to be a little more challenging.
Okay, so I wonder what that situation means for the second risk you listed, the second and third one in your report, which is U.S.-China and U.S.-China decoupling.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, if it does seem that American leadership is under question or under a cloud, what does that do for China's status in the world?
Well, I mean, we do see after 50 years of Davos that we are now seeing a tipping point in globalization. And that tipping point comes because of the decoupling of the United States from China, China from the United States in technology, in data, which means that unlike on trade, where we're competitors, but we both ultimately want to cooperate, we want to trade more. On AI and on data, we actually want each other to fail, right? It's becoming a zero-sum battle with the two largest economies in the world and the part of the economy that's the most advanced, that's growing the fastest, right? Obviously, that's not a good thing. For the future of efficient markets, for the future of the economy, and also in terms of where global conflict goes. And a lot of countries out there, like India, are going to have to decide where they align with technologically. And I can tell you the Indians do not want to decide between the Americans and the Chinese in technology. It's a bad position for you to be in.
Okay, speaking of India, you've reassessed your view of Prime Minister Modi and his ability to carry out economic reform. You were a lot more optimistic before we went into his second
first term, that's right.
Yes, and now you think differently.
That's right. Well, of course, the Indian economy is not growing nearly as fast. We saw the IMF just downgraded them more than any other major economy in the world on the back of that. And in order for Modi to win a majority that very few thought he could pull off in the last election, he moved away from some of those economic reforms, and he's instead leaned into Hindu nationalism. He's done that with Kashmir, and more recently he's done that on issues of citizenship, and of course in anti-Muslim policies and orientations, particularly by his home minister, 14% of the Indian population. So I haven't become anti-Modi. I wasn't pro-Modi before, but before in his first term, the priorities were clearly about economic reform at the high level and also bringing up the poor people at the low level. Now we see that those things still exist, but they're not as high a priority as the Hindu nationalism pieces that are really helping to drive the country, drive Modi's base, but also drive India farther apart, creating kind of polarization. And that clearly isn't good for the Indian economy.
You travel the world, Ian. How has that impacted the world's perception of India?
It has impacted. In the United States, when Modi came to Texas and filled that stadium, more people probably showed up than the inauguration for Trump. Howdy Modi. I mean, you know, he was considered to be a much more successful leader. And I would say now, particularly among the Democrats in the United States, the human rights issues in India, they're starting to get comparisons with the way the Chinese are treating the Uyghurs. That's ridiculous for a country, a democratic institutions, checks and balances like India. For example, on the conservative side, the fact that the Indians are moving ahead with the purchases of the S-400 missile defense system from the Russians makes the defense industry feel like they can't work with Indians as closely, might lead to some sanctions. And of course, one of the most important anchors of U.S.-India concrete economic cooperation is in the defense sector. So I think for both sides, the Indians have actually taken some hits from the United States.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about one more risk in your report because I found that to be the most interesting one, where you speak about MNCs and how they're losing power across the world. And I thought that would be really interesting for our audience to try and understand what is it that you're forecasting will be this loss of power for multinational corporations.
What we're forecasting is that at a time when everyone is saying multinationals need to do more, actually, number one, the global economy is slowing somewhat, so it's going to be harder for them to make profitability. Number two, we have this decoupling of globalization at the U.S.-China level on technology, while inside countries you have a backlash against corporations and their profits. Populists saying, we want to squeeze. We're going to hit these guys because we're anti-billionaire. We see it with Sanders and Warren, but you also see it in Europe with Vestager and the rest. Well, in that environment, CEOs with difficult jobs who only last 5 years on average are going to focus much more on their bottom line. They're going to focus less on refugees and on climate, unless it's core to their business plan, right? So I think for most CEOs in the West, they'll come to Davos and they'll say the right things, but they're their actions are going to be more focused on the shareholder.
Okay,
that's the issue.
One final question.
Yeah.
You've been now talking for a couple of years about a geopolitical recession that's hit the world.
Yes.
What is that going to mean for, countries like India or across the world in this new decade?
I mean, less leadership from the United States, nobody else that can play the global leadership role, the G0 we have in the world, means that you have more conflict. It means that you have less efficiency in global markets. It makes it harder for people to want to take risks in riskier markets like in India. So generally speaking, for emerging markets, unless your governance is really solid, it's going to be more of an uphill climb. Part of the reason the geopolitical recession is going to be deeper is because it doesn't affect the United States as much as it affects other countries. World's largest energy producer, food producer, refugees have a hard time getting to the United States, right? In the case of India, these problems are much more real. They're much more immediate, so it's a problem.
And that's going to mean governments are going to look even more inward and more insular. So a decade of hyper-nationalism?
A decade of more nationalism, a decade where that nationalism is constrained by stronger institutions in the developed economies, but in the emerging economies, one where elections will whiplash policies back and forth from one to the other. We see that happening already.
Ian, thank you so much for your time
Sure,
and for bracing the cold.
That's what
Thanks so much.
See you guys.